Are over here. Yeah, so thanks, Dave, for inviting me, the Adapt Center, for hosting us today. 2017 feels like 20 years ago. But, that talk, I focused on attacking Google. I didn't want to repeat myself, so I thought I'd attack Facebook, especially because we visited Google on Monday. Facebook didn't invite us, so I think they did. So yeah, I'm going to talk probably for too long. If I don't make any sense, just buy the book. If I do make sense, you can also buy the book. I apologize for not having brought enough copies for everyone, but there are bookmarks out there with information, so hopefully that helps. And yeah, so what did I want to talk about today? I don't know if you remember the 2016 election. I'm from the United States, so it comes up a few times. And what I wanted to think about was this kind of story. So this fake news posted by the Denver Guardian the week of the 2016 election. This article gets shared more than stories by New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post. And really, I think what should concern us here is not that the story is made up, not that it's fake news posted just before the election might have affected people. What I think should really bother us is the fact there is no such thing as the Denver Guardian. So really, this is one of those fun cases where I think we really need to rethink what we think fake news means. So oftentimes we talk about this idea that these stories are being floated around and that we're just missing the details, and if we just have the media literacy necessary to educate the public on how to determine real news versus fake news. I think this case actually helps to remind us that what's at issue here might actually be something like nobody's clicking up the damn headline. So it's not about whether or not you can identify the story, it's about whether you even care about what you're sharing in the first place. And you can imagine, again, well, I'm already advancing myself. What we really need to think about, from my perspective, is sort of the philosophy operating behind all this. So what's driving us to do this? How do we think about this? How should we think about this? And as a philosophy professor, I do like to go back as far as possible. And as you can see here, Plato and Aristotle were already thinking about this in ancient Greece. That's only half a joke. So what do we think social media is? In philosophy of technology, we typically describe three different primary perspectives on how to think about technology. So on the one hand, you have this very dystopian concept. Technology determines everything we do, everything we think. The machines are coming to kill us, machines are coming to take our jobs. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Terminator 2 or 5, whichever Terminator movie most identifies your perspective. On the opposite side, you have technology as the greatest thing ever. Any problem we have today can be solved by the technology of tomorrow. Climate change isn't a concern, we'll go to Mars. Once we kill Mars, we'll go to Jupiter, it's all fine. And again, we're all going to live forever anyway because we'll just upload ourselves into the cloud. And then in the middle, you have this instrumentalist approach where you think it's not about the technology. Everyone's misled because really technology is just a tool. It's not good or bad. What matters is who's using it. So obviously the only thing that should concern us, even in things like fake news, are the people who's sharing it and the people who's allowing it to be shared, not the specific technology on which it's shared. So, before I move on, quick show of hands, who's in team determinism? 1, 2, all right. Team utopia? 1, all right. And team instrumental? Wow, all right. This works everywhere I go around the world. It's amazing. And it's amazing to me, considering you're in a digital humanities hub, how many of you are willing to lie about where you are on this position. But if we think about this specifically in terms of social media, Twitter is certainly a great example for this. Again, you have this sort of, we're one tweet away from Trump killing us all. On the other hand, you have things like Occupy Gezi. Twitter is a revolutionary tool that's going to unite the masses and finally bring the democratic hope of the internet to fruition. And then in the middle, you have it's just another way of talking. And if I can shout horrible things at people in a bar, why does it matter if I shout horrible things online? It's just the shouting that should matter, right? So let's look at this utopian perspective a little bit more. If you all know Mark Zuckerberg, yeah, that you know him is already sort of the theme of what I'm talking about tonight. But again, it's important to remember, I don't know how many of you have been following Mark Zuckerberg, but he does have a vision for Facebook. I mean, he's very clear about this. And it's very much, again, sort of this idea of openness as an overriding principle of what we can achieve on Facebook. And really this idea that when we talk about things like Facebook violating privacy, you can imagine from Zuckerberg's perspective, that's just a wrong-headed way of thinking about privacy, that it's really preventing us from being social. So you can't, from his perspective, have it both ways. You can't say, I wish people were more social, but also say, well, we have to protect our privacy. Because there's the contradiction that Facebook was designed to overcome, right? And again, isn't it great to be able to find long-lost relatives, long-lost friends, long-lost exes? What could be better? Instrumental perspective. You might have remembered when Zuckerberg went before the United States Congress. I think he might have gone in front of your Congress. Can't remember. I think he went on some kind of government tour.
U.S. Congress.
Yeah, but didn't he go? Someone came to Dublin, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. And again, what was fascinating for me, and this is why I highlight this quote, his opening statement, this apology, he immediately establishes this instrumentalist perspective on what Facebook is. And this is never questioned, never pushed back against. So from my perspective, he already won the hearing at that point. Because once we all accept the definition, the framing of what Facebook is, it's just a tool, then you can immediately go down the, Cambridge Analytica was bad actors. We just have to figure out how to get bad actors out of the system. And you can already understand, again, this idea that sort of shocked people at the time when he said, please regulate me. I agree with you, we need more regulation. Because of course, again, it sort of reinforces this idea that if the tool has bad people using it, then I'm happy to help you find a good algorithm to fight the bad algorithms. Determinism, everyone's favorite. This was, it's not hard to find a negative story about Facebook nowadays, so I just picked the most recent one at the time. And again, this idea, when talking about Facebook's role on democracy, this was sort of one of these, everyone was afraid when they heard about deepfake videos that this was going to happen, and then it did happen, and Facebook's response was, well, it's not our problem, we're not going to delete it. So of course, people started making fake videos about Zuckerberg to see how much are they really going to stick to their guns on this idea. Now there's a program that's been developed called Deep Nude that uses an algorithm to look at any woman's photo and from any bare skin showing predict what she looks like naked and then create that as a postable photo on social media. It has a stamp on it that says it's fake, but if you just pay a little bit extra, they'll take that stamp off. Now, it's fascinating when BuzzFeed interviewed the engineer who invented Deep Nude. He said, I can see we should think about ethical concerns, but at the same time, someone's going to invent it, so why not me? And if you think about things like Google's program in China, it's again that same exact thinking, right? Someone's going to do it. We at least have good principles, so shouldn't we be the ones driving this, right? So again, we really need to think about not just the damage that a Facebook post can do, but the damage of the very platform being the one to decide how to handle it, right? Again, it's completely removed from us, and we're just sitting on our thumbs waiting to see what Facebook does. Next question. Let's turn to Heidegger. If you've never heard of Martin Heidegger, I apologize. He was a Nazi. Just get that out there before it comes up in the Q&A. There's always someone who gets a little too excited to point that out. And what's fascinating for me, Martin Heidegger is a philosopher, 20th century. And when I say Nazi, I don't mean that he occasionally goose-stepped. I mean like he had Nazi training program in his backyard. So he's full card-carrying Nazi. We could just get that out of the way. But what's fascinating for me is that this is a classic example of when you're an intellectual trying to get engaged with politics and you listen to the propaganda. And for him, you can imagine that this Nazi, let's go back to German traditional values, well, for him, that lines up perfectly with his philosophy. That's what we want. So when he saw what happened, what the Nazis were actually doing, he did not leave the party, but he did start to question the role of technology in a new way. And he sort of can be seen as sort of single-handedly inventing the field of philosophy of technology. He's basically put in timeout, kind of like the Me Too movement for Nazis in the 40s. So he was put in timeout for a few years, made his Louis C.K. comeback with this lecture tour with him and Werner Heisenberg, the famous German physicist who was also put in timeout. And basically they went on this tour around Germany, these social clubs, asking what is technology, how should we think about technology? We just had the atomic bomb. This is clearly a world-changing phenomenon. We can't just treat it like this is old philosophy applied to a new thing. We have to rethink philosophy. So he publishes this lecture called The Question Concerning Technology, and really wants to ask, what is the essence of technology? And this is just to upset you as quickly as possible. He says right at the start, whether you're for technology or against it is pretty irrelevant. But if you're neutral, if you're in team instrumentalism, then that's the worst possible answer you could give. Because that's what reveals just how utterly blind you are to the role technology plays today. So he's been accurately predicting for 66 years now that you were going to raise your hand on that one. Now, Heidegger is famous for being hard to understand, so I've tried to give you a quick roadmap of the essay. It's kind of ironic that I find PowerPoint is really helpful for analyzing his essay on technology. But what he focuses on, and what I want to focus on for tonight, is this idea that if we're going to confront the essence of technology, then we have to confront it in terms of truth. Okay, so this is really its essence. Its essence is its ability to reveal truth. And this is where this Greek concept of aletheia, so when we talk about truth today, just to get you as complicatedly philosophical as possible, we are typically talking about the Latin adequatio, so just the correspondence theory of truth, this is this. Whereas the Greek aletheia conception is more about truth as revealing. And this idea of bringing something out, bringing something forth, that's what's truth. So how does technology do that? He gives this fun example that my Dutch students like, where he talks about windmills. And he says that basically we can draw a distinction between ancient technology and modern technology. And the distinction is in terms of this idea that ancient technology not only respected nature, but revealed it. So again, this revealing concept of truth, that it's in the windmill. And it's important, if you've ever been to the Netherlands as a tourist, like I was, you immediately go to look for a windmill, and you're very excited to take a photo of the windmill and post it on Facebook. And as soon as you get to Schiphol Airport, there's already windmills everywhere, so they know what you're here for. And again, this idea that we try to preserve these windmills, that they are seen as sort of a temple to the wind. And Heidegger reminds us that for the ancients, there were 4 winds, and they were each gods, and he made sacrifices to the wind, and that the windmill did not force wind to do anything. It respected the wind, and it just lived with the wind, and actually revealed the power of the wind, that if there is no wind, we die. That we are powerless before the power of the wind. And he says modern technology, this kind of windmill, completely changes the game. And you have instead this idea of turning the wind into a power source. And importantly for Heidegger, it's not just a power source, but it's importantly this idea of a battery, that we are storing the power to be used on demand. And it's importantly this on-demandness that he really finds as key to understanding this distinction between the modern and the ancient. And this idea that we no longer respect nature, we no longer revere nature. If you said that you were concerned about the god of the wind, people would think you're a crazy person today. Instead, you would have your solar panel, and you'd be very excited when you're making money off the sun. You have your dam that controls the water. And again, this sort of idea that we are, as he puts it, lords of the earth, that everything is here for us, and technology finally lets us do what the Bible said we're supposed to be doing. We're on top, and nature was made for us. Now, what's interesting is he says one example of how we do not realize the connection between humanity and technology is this idea that if you are working in the forestry industry, if you are someone who cuts down trees for a living, he says that basically you're also in the propaganda industry because you're helping to make the paper that's going to be printed in the newspaper. But we don't think of ourselves that way. We divide our roles into new ways. But importantly, what he wants us to think about is that in the same way that I want nature on demand, he says we make ourselves on demand. So again, you can imagine, there's a paper shortage, we need more paper, we call forth people that they're there for us, right? In the same way that if you're drunk at 2 a.m. and send a you up text, it's again this on-demandness, right? And you can see how we have a Tinder in the wake of what Heidegger's talking about, more or less. We don't need to get into that right now. What's interesting is Don Eide, American philosopher of technology, basically said, I like Heidegger's recentering philosophy on technology. I don't like so much, one, that he was a Nazi, and two, I don't like so much that he was negative about technology. So I want to stick with the idea that technology has a role in truth. I don't want the that's bad part of it. So he says, if we go back to this way of thinking, and if you've ever taken a philosophy class, you should know that if a professor gives you 3 options, the answer is option 4. I do like Photoshop, I apologize. If you've seen the Duck Rabbit, I matrixed it a little bit. But this German optical illusion is really sort of captures what Don Eide means by this idea of technology as multi-stable. This idea that in the same way that this is a duck or a rabbit, it's actually both. Technology isn't good or bad, it's both. And again, it's going to be different in different contexts for different people. So he wants us to stop thinking about technology, capital T, and start thinking about technologies, get much more context dependent, much more individual dependent. So he says basically, this helps us to also think about how to move past one of these traditional philosophical problems that we call subject-object dualism. This idea that humans are the agents of action. We are the ones who can do anything that is done, so we're the only ones that we should be thinking about in terms of ethics, that we should be thinking about in terms of politics. and that everything else is just inert objects that we act upon. So again, a very physics way of thinking, right? There's an object of mass. If it's moving, somebody pushed it. The person who pushed it is the one that we should be concerned about, this kind of thinking. And he says, no, that's not how human existence actually works. How human existence actually works is that we are who we are because of our relationship to the world. And the world is what it is because of its relationship to us. And this is what comes out in this concept of co-constitution. So now that I'm a parent, I think a lot about forks, and specifically how to use a fork right. But it's weird as a philosophy professor to tell my son he's using a fork wrong, but I do it. Because as a phenomenologist, I want to say, I respect that you've answered the call of the fork. That if you say, I know what a fork is a utensil, it's something that you design for eating. And then you want to say, well, if you use it to drum on the table, that's wrong. Instead of saying, no, that the fork is just what you use it for. It's just how you relate to it. This is what we're trying to get through in this concept of multi-stability. That there are multiple stable ways of thinking about it, and it can go from any one of these. And importantly, just as when I constitute the fork as a utensil, I am constituted as an eater. When I think of the fork or relate to the fork as a toy, I am a player, and when I start stabbing people with it, I'm a murderer. So again, in the same way that I constitute the fork, it constitutes me. And it's again that sort of co-constitution relationship that we're trying to understand. So the way we understand this is in terms of human-technology relations. And the parentheses and the hyphens are really where the game is here. So Don Heide uses this scheme of these 4 human-technology relations. Embodiment relations would be, for example, I am a glasses wearer. I see several of my brothers and sisters in the audience tonight. And what's important is, again, this idea that I say I see you. But really what's happening is I see the glasses see you. And what embodiment relations are meant to capture is this idea that when the glasses become absorbed into my bodily schema, they fall out of my awareness, they fall out of my concern. And this is what they're designed to do. Because if I am paying attention to the glasses, if I'm actually looking at the glasses, I can't see you anymore. In the same way that if you've ever tried to pay attention to your own walking, you're going to trip, right? In sports, we call this the yips, when you're a little too focused on your golf swing. I'm trying to use an Irish example. And again, this idea that the more you're aware that you're playing golf, the less you're actually playing golf, right? So this is, again, the embodiment relation. The golf club should be an extension of your arm, right? In the same way the glasses should be an extension of my eyes, that my cane should be an extension of my arm and leg schema. I should not be aware of it. In a hermeneutic relation, it's a little different. Here you have, if you've ever used the computer, I know it's hard to remember, but this idea that you're connected to the world through the computer. And this idea, again, going back to the fake news issue, is this idea of how, when we're talking about fake news on Facebook, is it the news that's fake, or is it the Facebook that's fake? Is it the algorithm that's fake? Is it the sharing of it that's fake? And how can I actually tell? When we're just using this term fake news, where is the fake actually located, right? And again, this idea, Don Heide likes using the 3 Mile Island disaster, but maybe a more recent, if you've seen HBO's Chernobyl, not to give away the first episode, but the first episode is basically on this problem of hermeneutic relations. This idea that if your only connection to the nuclear rods is through what the panel is telling you, and you have no other way, because if you go and look, you die, then if there's a problem on the panel itself, you have no way of knowing, right? So this is like if the engine light of your car goes on, right? Is it the light or the engine? And you just pray you get it right? Alterity relations, this is, I always like this photo of the guy with the 2 phones. But again, this idea that this is where I'm actually related to the technology, and I'm so focused on it that I lose sight of the world around me. This would be perhaps most recently the Pokemon Go phenomenon. In the Netherlands, we had roving gangs of cyclists, got to collect them all. I don't know if you had something similar here. I imagine, I know it feels like 40 years ago that Pokemon Go was a thing, but it was huge when it was a thing, right? But again, this idea, you had people walking into the Holocaust Museum because Pokemon Go told them to, and they were paying absolutely no attention to where they were, right? I think it was in South Korea, they started putting up special road signs for Pokemon Go. And what was fascinating was, of course, because you're looking at the phone, the signs were not for the Pokemon Go players, it was for the drivers, so they stopped running them over. Just let that sink in for a second. Background relations, the one we think least about, but is actually most important for our everyday lives, is the role that technology plays in shaping how we think about the world itself. So for example, when we came in here, we had to turn on the AC, we had to turn on the lights, we have the Wi-Fi, all the things that make the room work, but that you're, again, not supposed to pay any attention to, right? And if you're paying attention to them, it's because something is wrong, right? So again, this is more or less, there are more human-technology relations, but this helps us to understand at least most of our reaction. So, to sum up, the idea is that traditionally we thought humans are what we should focus on, we're the ones who perceive, we're the ones that act, technology is just means to our ends. And now, thanks to the worst word we've ever come up with, post-phenomenology, I think even Don Heide has apologized recently for this word. Technologies are not mere means, technologies actually mediate, they shape how we see the world, they shape how we act in the world. And thus, and the simplest way to put it is, if you're going to do ethics and not think about this human-technology connection, then your ethics is meaningless. And of course, this also applies to politics, right? We have to get right what's the unit of analysis, to put it bluntly, right? If we're only talking about the human, then we're missing something. If we're only talking about the technology, we're missing something. Now, what I found fascinating from my work was that Don Heide, who I would otherwise put as a technology utopian. You can tell him I said that, it's fine. The one time he gets close to critical is when he talks about this idea that we have something like an ambivalent relationship to technologies. That basically, what he takes from Heidegger is that the essence of technology is this relationship of revealing and concealing. Right? Again, that's the connection to truth, right? Technology reveals, but it also conceals. So in each of those human-technology relations, something is brought to the fore. Like again, my vision is improved, but the glasses themselves disappear, right? The computer, I get more knowledge, but the computer's role in that knowledge disappears. This kind of revealing, concealing. And it says basically what I want, and this is the ambivalence, I want the technological transformation of the world. I don't want the technology doing the transforming. So you can imagine if I were to give a quick talk on transhumanism, which I can if you want. I'm basically a jukebox at this point. When we talk about how technology is moving us into this post-human world where we're going to live forever, it's again this sort of idea that we have to rethink what we mean by human in terms of this technology. And again, we have to rethink that what I want is to be able to sort of absorb the technology into me, but I'm still me, right? And it's that kind of fantasy that Heide is pointing to here, right? In the same way that I think I like my improved vision, I don't like the glasses, so I'll get laser surgery, but still the laser is what's changing my eyes, and then that has to be redone and redone. So again, you can never get away from the technology, right? Even if you say, this is my favorite thing in the US, I'm going to take a vacation from technology. I'm just going to go into the woods for a couple days and unplug. This is what we say in Silicon Valley. We're going to unplug, right? And it should warn you that Silicon Valley loves that term. It's again the very idea of, well, how did you pick the forest? How did you get through the forest? There's still technology, right? There's this fantasy that we're somehow getting away from it, that it's finally me connecting to it, right? That I get through this mindfulness seminar. But still, the very concept of mindfulness involves technological research. So again, we're never away from it. I want to get away from it, that's the key. So, in each of these relations, importantly, we can think about this revealing, concealing in different ways in different relations. And again, this idea that you have the reveal, conceal visually, hermeneutic, you have the amplification of knowledge, but a reduction of what's forming the knowledge. And in alterity relations, this is where you think about robots, for example. You get very excited when you see a robot walking down the street. But at the same time, you're like kind of worried it's going to go take your job. There you go. So what does this mean for us? Well, if we go back to Facebook, what I want to focus on is this idea that I think when we talk about Facebook, we misconstrue what Facebook is because we only talk about it on one level. And importantly, we shift, depending on the conversation, which level we're talking about it, instead of realizing that it's all of these levels simultaneously. So this is what I really want to focus on, this idea that Facebook is a one-many, if you want to get into ancient Greek philosophy again, a one-many problem. So again, it has embodiment relations. It's a way for me to communicate beyond my bodily ability. It has hermeneutic relations. This is where you learn a lot of news updates through your Facebook newsfeed. It has alterity relations, where we get a little too focused on Mark Zuckerberg. And background relations, again, where you have Facebook forming the world in ways that you don't even realize. So, what does that mean in terms of things like nihilism? Well, this is what I want to talk about. I think I still have time. How are we doing?
Yes, another 2 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. Never sure how much time I have left for the really negative stuff. So, we talk about things like dependency. I was once given advice, maybe you've gotten this advice from a parent or grandparent, that the best way to not get fired from a job is to make yourself indispensable to the running of the company. Well, that's more or less what Facebook has done to our daily lives, right? So that even the people who are most famously critics of Facebook, like here's Zeynep Tufekci, still has to say, like, I can't get off of it. It's not that simple, right? There's the number of things that I can do through Facebook that I cannot do without Facebook makes it so that even though I am immensely critical of it, I'm still on it, right? And then you find out fun things like, because I always have the fun student when I teach ethics of technology who will say something like, well, I'm a clever person, I don't have Facebook because I'm aware of privacy concerns. But then Facebook creates shadow profiles for people so that even if you're not on Facebook, you're on Facebook, which is kind of a fun coercive way of making you get on Facebook, because if you actually are concerned about privacy, then you have to be on Facebook to know what's actually being said about you on Facebook. Hermeneutic relations. Again, you have fun issues. Again, this came up very clearly in the 2016 election. It came up in Brexit. Sorry to bring it up. But again, this idea, so how do we police this? Well, of course, we start doing things like fact-checking. But it's important to remember that fact-checking is political, because who's the checker? So Facebook, much like every other Silicon Valley company, gets accused by the right of having a left bias. So to compensate, they get people from the right onto the board. The problem is, again, this both sides mentality, that if you have someone from the left and someone from the right, well then we're good, because it'll all balance out. But part of the problem, I'm sure this is only true in the US, not in Ireland, is that because the right defines who's on the left, then actually who would be seen as politically centrist dominates the left, and then you have center-right, and that's your balance, right? So again, this is the kind of thing you have here, where you have, like right now I think there's a social media summit at the White House, right? So again, you have this sort of, you don't want to rock the boat with politicians, so you try to be as political as possible. But again, you get tricked into overcompensating. Now, what I always like to think about in terms of, again, when we talk about Facebook and privacy concerns, is that when you think about it from a purely economic standpoint, when you think about just Facebook growth over time in relation to these privacy concerns, I assume even if you haven't taken Econ 101, you can understand the curve here. This does not hurt their bottom line. Even when Facebook, even when Zuckerberg is before Congress, seemingly what you would imagine to be its most dangerous political position, he's making money while testifying, right? There aren't a lot of people who get to say that, right? By testifying, I'm making money. But what I want to focus on is the idea that it's important Zuckerberg is not Facebook. He is Facebook, but he's not Facebook. And I think, again, it's important to think about the degree to which he helps to distract us from thinking about Facebook in other ways, because we get a little too excited by whenever there's a Zuckerberg press release, in the same way we used to think about Steve Jobs and Apple. That whenever there's a new update, it kind of takes over the news, and we talk about, oh, there's Facebook Live, oh, there's Facebook Newsfeed. And again, this idea that we have this sort of fantasy of the genius sitting in a room, probably in an egg-shaped chair, sipping something green, and just kind of being like, well, what if we had virtual Facebook? And you're like, $1 billion done, right? And again, that's not how it works. But it's important, and this is why you also have this sort of pop culture representation of the tech mogul. I thought actually the recent Black Mirror, I know that not everyone was a fan of the last season, but this episode where they portrayed the Mark Zuckerberg equivalent as this guy up on a mountain retreat, as sort of a god away from humanity. Again, that sort of relationship that we have to these tech giants, where we just imagine that they're above the law. There's nothing they couldn't get away with. In the United States, we were just kind of assuming Zuckerberg was going to run for president and that he would win. Now, this is what I find most alarming. When people try to do research on Facebook, you discover things sometimes that you didn't realize you were going to discover. So, for example, University of Illinois, Carrie Carhelios, is doing a study on people's relationship to the newsfeed algorithm, and much to her surprise, people had no idea newsfeed had an algorithm. And what's especially alarming to me is this description. We got a lot of visceral responses to discovery when they didn't know. A lot of people just spent literally 5 minutes being in shock. One person describes it as discovering you're in the Matrix. So again, this is what I meant at the beginning when I was talking about the degree to which we talk about things like media literacy as the concern, instead of things like technology literacy more broadly. That if you're just talking about how to identify stories as true or false, instead of how to identify the algorithm that drove the story to you in the first place. So, good question. Why do you stay? I don't know if you remember this moment, but you basically get this sort of, showdown. You could almost hear an Ennio Morricone soundtrack to this question, right? So should you be above the law? That's more or less the question, right? Thinks about it for a second, yes. Moves on, right? And Facebook HQ is just cheering, right? Again, this sort of fascinating turning the tables, right? So you have Facebook called before Congress, everyone's very excited about it, and then you immediately realize no one on Congress has any idea how Facebook works. They have no idea how to interrogate it. And again, what's fascinating to me is that Jacques Ellul, a French sociologist in the 1950s, was already warning us about this, way before the internet. And he has this idea of technocracy, which importantly is not what we think of technocracy today. For him, technocracy means technology becomes so complicated, so embedded in our social systems, that we basically cannot govern without technology, and everything we talk about in terms of governance involves technology. But here's the kicker. The only people who have the power to understand and regulate technology are the tech experts. But the problem is, and this is why it's not the technocracy we think it is, Ellul says nobody in technology has any interest in politics. They do not want the political power that only they have. So what does this do? It creates a vacuum. And nobody can step into it. So you can imagine that we have this problem that we really don't know how to fix whenever we talk about things like regulation. And then we get shocked when Zuckerberg says, sure, regulate me all you want. Because who else is going to regulate him but a Zuckerberg-level person? So again, you have bad guy with an algorithm versus good guy with an algorithm. And if you've been following guns in the US, you've seen how well that works. Here's one fun way to think about it. The Cambridge Analytica case. You've probably been aware that anytime a tech company does something wrong, they go to Twitter, tweet one, I'm sorry, but then they keep tweeting, and they tweet themselves right out of the sorry. This is like when a student gives a presentation and you're ready to give an A, but they keep talking. So again, you have tweet 5. Actually, you can just kind of feel the actually in a tweet, right? Actually, advertising is not coercive. People are smart, right? So really, if you're going to blame us, you're the ones who think people are idiots. We are the ones who actually respect humanity. But, and I can't believe this was still the case a year after this tweet, you go to Cambridge Analytica website, there's their advertisement. You are powerless. So again, which is it? How do we think about it? Well, whenever students ask me what's the most cutting-edge philosophy you can think about in terms of technology, for me it's 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He described himself as a man of tomorrow, so take him at his word. He said it would take about 100 years for people to understand him, so we're right about on time. And what's fascinating is for Nietzsche, this is really the central problem of his philosophy, about what it means to be human. And again, this idea that we don't know who we are. And what's fascinating is he makes it more complicated. He says, basically, I like to think of this as like a drive-by attack on Karl Marx. He never mentions Marx by name, but he has this very quick, it's obviously because we're busy bees, right? We're just too busy. If we just have the communist revolution, we'll all have the free time to be human again. And then whenever I teach Marx, you always have a student raise their hand and say, right, why didn't we have the revolution? And I think Nietzsche gives you the best answer. We didn't want it. We don't want the revolution. Maybe you actually like having a boss. Maybe you actually like having someone to complain about. You like having someone to blame for how stressful work is. Because again, if you don't, then it's on you. So he gives a second answer. And it's almost an Oscar Wilde-like answer. The problem is earnestness, right? That we just don't want to know. So the problem isn't, in theory, in Dublin right now. It is amazing how many things I can find to do, and then I'm just always too worn out at night to think anymore, right? And then you have Netflix and chill anyway. So again, this sort of classic, I'm finally going to have some free time this weekend, and then you're shocked that it's Monday already, right? And for Nietzsche, that's not an accident. We do this by design. So why do we do it? I know, it's a surprise given the title of the book that this was coming. So what is nihilism, other than the title of a book that is coming out in September with MIT Press? What's interesting, he says, it's interestingly connected to progress. So again, he says, there is something about progress that makes us unhappy. In other words, there's something that we find sort of disappointing about the progress we expect and the progress we actually get. Because again, pointing back to Heidegg's ambivalence, you expect the progress to be in you, not in the technology. And this is kind of the problem he's always pointing to when he talks about this leveling effect, that we never get any better, the technology gets better. But I still look around at people and it's still the same damn people. And I keep expecting us to become these superhuman gods that technology keeps promising and that I see in the movies, and it's just not happening. So one way to think about this that I like is to think about in terms of public transportation, which again will hopefully come to the United States one day. It's shocking living in a country that has public transportation. I hope you don't take it for granted, because we just drive everywhere and destroy the planet. But again, this idea, if you get on a bus or a train, you take your bag, you plant it on the seat next to you, you take out your phone, maybe you also put on some sunglasses, and you just kind of create this little fun bubble. So as much as you hate Donald Trump, you still build the wall as soon as you get on the bus. Because that's little Trump inside of all of us. And again, what I find most fascinating is when someone actually comes and needs the seat next to you, and maybe it's just the American in me that does this, but I'm guessing some of you do this too, where you kind of look the person up and down and kind of like judge if they're worthy. And then if they sit down next to you, again, your border fence goes up. If their thigh touches your thigh, you just get into this murderous rage, right? And again, you can kind of get the sense that when you're on public transportation, all that matters to you is that I want to get to where I'm going as quickly as possible, as painlessly as possible. I don't want to see another person, I don't want to touch another person, I certainly don't want to smell another person, I definitely don't want to taste another person, and just get me there. And I think for Nietzsche, this is pretty much how we relate to life as a whole. I just want to get to the end point with as little pain, as little friction, as little human contact as possible. Just let me be, again, Netflix and chill, just I'm going to stay at home tonight, leave me alone, right? So you can kind of see already how this leads to things like Uber or Lyft or whatever taxi service you like to have, right? Again, this sort of, how can I get away from people? Or the Amazon drone service, where again, Amazon was already, I don't have to deal with clerks in a store, isn't that great? But I still have to deal with the mail carrier. And it's just that one human being in the loop that if I could just get rid of them, then everything's great. So why are we weary? He says that basically the problem is morality. We don't like basically the good people we've become. We get very bored of each other. Maybe you've had a relationship where you wished your partner was more spontaneous, but then they actually do something that's genuinely spontaneous, and you're like, that's not what I meant. I meant we just do pizza on Tuesday, not Thursday this week. And again, this idea that he says, and I think this connects very well to issues of big data and AI, Hannah Arendt has a similar point, that basically if we are able to make predictions about human behavior, it's because we've made ourselves predictive. That what it means to be human is to be fundamentally spontaneous. So the very fact that big data algorithms work, for Hannah Arendt, this is alarming. That means we're not people anymore. So instead of being like, wow, it's great, I can predict where bicycles around the city are going to be and I can bring them back, we should be like, why on earth am I so predictable? And again, for Nietzsche, it's because of how good we are. So how does this play out in technologies? Apple, I love this new mindfulness app that comes with every Apple Watch and its Apple Health package. This is a meditation app, a mindfulness app. Maybe you've heard of mindfulness. That basically is like a Fitbit for your soul. That kind of reminds you every once in a while that you should meditate. And you just breathe with the flower image. Breathe with the flower image. And it gives you meditation points. And you can compare with others about, are you more mindful, less mindful? We also, especially in the Netherlands, because we have Philips and Eindhoven, we're getting better and better at smart lighting solutions, which should always raise the question of the solution to what question? And this idea that we can make you a happier worker, we can make you a more productive worker, and it should also alarm you that happy and productive are always treated as the same. By just using these lighting designs that are scientifically proven to make people feel more relaxed, especially because it follows the diurnal light pattern of the day, so you have a natural light effect. And what, of course, is fascinating is that because it's been scientifically attuned to the human, if you still feel stressed at work, well, then it must be you. This connects very well with, Facebook, of course, had a problem with people killing themselves on Facebook Live. How do you solve that? You don't get rid of Facebook Live. You try to predict when people are going to kill themselves. This kind of speaks for itself. My favorite, my first book, I talked about 24 as torture propaganda. I like to think of BBC Sherlock as facial recognition propaganda. Because that is who he is, right? He's the walking, talking embodiment of facial recognition software. And what's especially fascinating is that everyone who he immediately uses his big data brain to analyze, it's very excited about it. Right? And again, it's sort of, you can see into the future that this is how we're going to relate to these predictive technologies. If you have a technology that can tell you if you're depressed, you don't think, well, that's invasive. You think, I need to know. So, am I running out of time? Okay, I'll just finish with this one. So for me, in the same way that Nietzsche talked about religion and the role of the priest as trying to help us overcome our nihilism by helping distract us from our unhappiness and find various mechanisms, which he described as basically these 5. So you have drinking, work hard, donate to charity, make friends, and then have Carnival or Mardi Gras. I think that basically this is also how to think about tech companies today, that these are the new priests. And that again, this is how to conceive of technologies across industries as basically giving a sub-version of this as well, which I don't really have time to talk about, but you're welcome to read the book. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.